Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, your peaceful space to unwind and relax. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more cozy stories every night. So, where are you watching it from? And what are you doing right now? I hope you're in a comfortable spot, maybe with a warm drink, ready to let the calm take over. Tonight's story is one that will take you far into the heart of Middle-earth, a land of timeless beauty and ancient mysteries. We'll drift into the quiet woods of Mirkwood, where the Elven King Thranduil faces an impossible choice. The world is on the edge of war, but amid the tension, an unlikely alliance is forged. So, take a deep breath, let go of the day, and allow the gentle flow of this tale to carry you into a world of adventure, friendship, and courage. Let the soothing rhythm of the story settle you, and let it guide you into a restful night's sleep. Now, sit back, relax, and let the story begin. Was shrouded in a quiet mist as the stars awakened one by one in the evening sky. It was the sort of night when silence itself seemed sacred, disturbed only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the faint chirping of crickets deep among the moss-laden roots. The trees stood tall and ancient, their branches interwoven like the fingers of forgotten gods, holding secrets older than men. This was not a forest of menace, not yet, not the Mirkwood it would become, but a place of solemn magic and eternal twilight. Amidst this tranquil realm, a single figure moved with grace and intent, King Thranduil, son of Orifer, lord of the woodland realm. Draped in silver and forest green, with a mantle that shimmered like dew under starlight, he walked softly, alone, leading behind the halls of his underground palace. There were few in his realm who would question his habits, fewer still who dared to ask where he went during such hours. He was a solitary king, enigmatic even to his own kin. Thranduil's eyes, bright like pale emeralds, skinned the path before him. There was no danger here, not tonight. The spiders kept to the far south, and the orcs had long retreated into the mountains with the rise of elven patrols. And yet, he moved like a shadow, swift and silent, until he reached a glade hidden behind a thicket of white-barked birches. Moonlight poured through the leaves above, bathing the clearing in silver hues. A rock sat at the center, smooth and moss-covered, like a natural table laid by the forest itself. Upon it lay a scroll. He paused before approaching, listening. Not for danger, but for something else, some deeper intuition that pulsed beneath his skin. The forest often whispered things to him. Not with words, but with sensations, unease, calm, warning. Tonight, it was a gentle hum, like a lullaby in a forgotten tongue. He stepped forward and took the scroll in hand. The parchment was bound with a ribbon of deep red, a color not often found in the hands of elves. He unfurled it slowly, the runes etched in a language he did not speak fluently, yet understood all the same, Thranduil, the secret tongue of the Dwarves. His lips tightened as he read, his eyes narrowing slightly. Balin. That was the name signed at the bottom of the letter. An old dwarf, older than most of the stone kin he had known, with a reputation for wisdom and an uncharacteristic sense of diplomacy. Thranduil remembered him well from a distant time when the world had not yet broken into the splinters of suspicion and pride. Balin had once stood beside Thorin Oakenshield, the proud prince of Erebor. And yet, unlike Thorin, he had always held a measure of respect for others, even the elves. The letter was cautious but clear. Balin wrote of unrest stirring in the east, beyond the borders of the dale and the lonely mountain. Readers had been seen under crimson banners, strange creatures marched alongside men with golden armor and cruel eyes. The Easterlings were gathering, not merely in scattered war bands but with purpose, as if summoned. Whispers of a new power taking shape in the shadows were spreading, one that neither elves nor dwarves could afford to ignore. And so, Balin offered a pact. Quiet. Discreet. A mutual understanding between old adversaries. No fanfare, no declarations, only a promise to share information, to warn one another of coming danger. It was a request forged not in friendship, but in necessity. Still, there was something rare in it. A glimmer of trust. Or perhaps, desperation. Thranduil let the scroll fall to his side and looked up at the sky. The stars were clear tonight, strewn across the heavens like scattered diamonds. He had once walked under those same stars beside his father, long before the fall of Doriath, long before the flames of war had etched cynicism into his soul. There was something in Balin's words that stirred an old ache in him, not for the past, but for the possibility of a different future. The Elven King closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The air was crisp, scented with pine and distant water. He did not answer the letter aloud, for that was not the Elven way. Instead, he turned and walked back into the forest, retracing his steps with purpose. The decision had already taken root in his heart, even if his mind refused to name it. Over the next few days, quiet preparations were made. A reply was crafted not in words but in action. A small pouch of medicinal herbs known only to elven healers was left in the hollow of a tree, along with a thin piece of bark carved with a symbol, a star circled by leaves. It was an old elven sign of ascent, one rarely used in modern times, almost forgotten by those who did not study ancient lore. But Balin would understand it. And if he did not, then perhaps the dwarves had changed more than Thranduil dared hope. Few in the woodland realm noticed the subtle shift in their king's demeanor. He walked more often, his gaze lingering on the borders of his land. When his captains brought reports of orc movement near the Grey Mountains, he listened more carefully. When his scouts mentioned signs of human passage from Run, he asked for details, not dismissals. The forest itself seemed to respond, as if sensing his vigilance. The birds flew lower, the deer were quieter. Even the trees swayed more cautiously, as though bracing themselves for a storm still far on the horizon. In the Hall of Feasts, the fire crackled softly as Thranduil sat in silence, swirling a goblet of spiced wine. Around him, music drifted like mist, soft, slow, full of memory. Legolas was not present. The young prince was far to the south, learning the ways of diplomacy among the elves of Lothlorien. Thranduil missed his presence, though he would never say it aloud. There were things a father could not share with his son, not yet. The burden of leadership often required solitude. A servant approached, bowing low. "My lord, the scouts report movement in the hills near Erebor. Riders, but not from Dale. They carry no flags." Thranduil nodded slowly. "Watch them. Do not engage unless they cross into our lands. But if they do, be silent as the snow, and strike like the wind." The servant bowed again and left. Thranduil remained, watching the flames. His fingers tightened slightly on the stem of his goblet. He had made a choice. And in the silent groves of Greenwood, where the stars bore witness and the trees held their breath, the first whispers of a secret pact took root. The night air was sharp with the scent of pine and fresh earth, the sort of cool stillness that only a forest untouched by war could offer. Thranduil stood on the balcony of his palace, looking out over the vast expanse of greenwood. The wind tugged gently at his silver cloak, causing the fine fabric to shimmer in the pale light of the rising moon. Beneath him, the forest stretched into the distance, dark and enigmatic, a realm of beauty and danger in equal measure. It had been several days since the arrival of the message from Balin, the dwarf of Erebor, and yet the Elven King had not made any outward moves. The events of that night in the forest lingered in his mind, stirring thoughts he had long buried. The ancient enmity between elves and dwarves was not something that could be easily forgotten. It was etched into the very bones of Middle-earth, a history of pride, loss, and betrayal that no amount of time could erase. And yet, despite his instincts, Thranduil knew that what Balin had proposed could not be dismissed out of hand. The dwarves were not the enemy they once were, at least, not in every sense. Thranduil's thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling behind him. He turned to see one of his most trusted servants, an elf named Elenian, approaching with a quiet step. Elenian had served Thranduil for many years, and the bond between them had grown beyond that of king and servant. It was one of understanding, forged in the fires of shared trials and unspoken trust. "My lord," Elenian said, his voice low and respectful. "The messenger has arrived from Erebor. He waits in the eastern hall, as you requested." Thranduil gave a single nod, his gaze lingering a moment longer on the vast expanse of the forest before he turned to follow Elenian. The corridors of the palace were quiet, as they always were at this time of night. The stone walls were cold to the touch, and the flickering torchlight cast long shadows that seemed to dance like memories of the past. They reached the eastern hall, a smaller, more intimate space compared to the grandeur of the great hall where the feasts were held. The air inside was warmer, and the scent of burning wood mixed with the faint aroma of fresh herbs. In the center of the room stood a figure, a dwarf, tall for his kind, with a thick beard braided in the manner of his people. His clothes were practical, though well-made, and the mark of Erebor was clear in the fine craftsmanship of his gear. The dwarf looked up as Thranduil entered, his expression guarded but respectful. "You are the messenger from Balin?" Thranduil asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. The dwarf gave a slight bow, his posture stiff but not unkind. "Yes, my lord. I bring word from Erebor, as requested." Thranduil gestured to the table nearby, where a decanter of wine and a pair of goblets rested. "You must be weary from your travels. Please, have some wine. We will speak more easily with it." The dwarf hesitated for a moment before accepting the offer, though his fingers brushed the goblet with an air of careful consideration. Thranduil poured the wine, its deep red color catching the torchlight as it swirled in the glass. He took a long sip before setting the goblet down and looking the dwarf in the eye. "I trust that Balin's message was as serious as it appeared?" Thranduil asked, his tone now more direct. He did not mince words, and neither did the dwarf. "Yes, my lord," the dwarf replied. "The situation is grave. There are forces stirring in the east, and the rumors we have heard speak of something darker than we have encountered in many years. Balin believes that if we do not stand together, both our peoples may fall. This is why he has sought your cooperation, quietly, discreetly. We cannot afford to draw attention." Thranduil leaned back, his long fingers resting lightly on the arm of the chair. He considered the dwarf's words carefully. There was no mistaking the sincerity in his voice, nor the weight of his conviction. The threat was real, and it was one that even the pride of the elves could not ignore. Tell me more about these forces, Thranduil said, his tone shifting to one of curiosity and caution. Who are they? What is their purpose? The dwarf took a deep breath, his brow furrowing as if the very thought of the enemy caused a flicker of unease to pass across his face. We do not know everything, my lord, the dwarf began. The Easterlings have always been a problem, but this time it is different. They have allied themselves with creatures we have not seen before, beasts of shadow, twisted things that do not belong in the world. Their leaders are unknown to us, and yet they gather strength as if they are preparing for something terrible. Thranduil's gaze hardened as he listened, his mind already turning over the implications of this new alliance. Shadow beasts, Easterlings, the words were like dark clouds on the horizon, foretelling a storm that would reach far beyond the borders of the woodland realm. And you believe this is a threat to Erebor? Thranduil asked, his voice low, as if weighing the burden of the decision. The dwarf nodded gravely. Aye, my lord. Erebor may be strong, but we are few, and the forces we face are unlike anything we have encountered before. If we do not stand together, I fear we will be overrun. And once Erebor falls, it will only be a matter of time before they turn their attention to the rest of Middle-earth. Thranduil's mind raced. Erebor, for all its wealth and might, was but a single stronghold in the mountains. The dwarves could be easily overwhelmed if these creatures from the shadows grew in power. But it was not only Erebor at risk. If the Easterlings and their twisted allies succeeded in their ambitions, no realm, be it elven, dwarven, or human, would be safe. A long silence passed between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Thranduil stared into the flames, his thoughts dark and distant. He had known that such a time would come. He had sensed it, deep in the marrow of his bones, even before the first whisper of the dwarves had reached his ears. But this was different. This was a new kind of war, one fought not with swords alone but with darkness and fear. One that threatened to undo all the fragile peace they had fought so hard to preserve. Finally, Thranduil spoke, his voice quiet but firm. I will send word to Balin. You may return with my response. The dwarf's expression was one of careful hope, but there was no mistake in his eyes. He knew what Thranduil's words meant. A decision had been made. And what will that response be, my lord? The dwarf asked, his tone now tinged with impatience. Thranduil stood slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the stone floor. He looked out toward the forest again, his eyes narrowed as though he were seeing something far beyond the trees. Then, he turned back to the dwarf, his face calm, his expression unreadable. You will have my answer, dwarf, Thranduil said, his voice unwavering. I will honor the request for secrecy, and I will send my forces to aid you. But this pact, it will be known only to those who need to know. If we are to survive this darkness, then we must be as silent as the night. The dwarf's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of gratitude passing through them. You have my thanks, my lord. We will not forget this. Thranduil inclined his head slightly, but he said no more. There was no need for further words. The pact had been made, and in that moment, both their fates had been intertwined. As the dwarf departed into the night, Thranduil remained standing in the room, his hand resting on the cold stone of the balcony. Below, the forest waited, as it always did, silent, patient, and full of secrets. The firelight flickered in his chamber, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and shift, as if echoing the uncertainty of the path ahead. The war that was coming would test them all. It would demand more than they had ever given before. But Thranduil, for the first time in many years, allowed himself a moment of peace. For even in the darkest of times, there was strength to be found in unlikely places. And for now, the fire burned brightly in the hearth, and the stars shone with a quiet, knowing light. The mountains loomed like ancient sentinels, their jagged peaks shrouded in mist and cloud. Erebor, the lonely mountain, stood in the heart of the Grey Mountains, a towering fortress of stone and steel, its entrance guarded by the ancient gates of Durin. Within its walls, the sound of hammers on anvils rang day and night as the dwarves continued to rebuild the kingdom that had once been lost to fire and darkness. Yet even the steady rhythm of their forges could not drown the sense of unease that had taken root in the hearts of those who lived within its halls. Balin, son of Fundin, was one of the few who had seen Erebor rise from the ashes. His heart was heavy with both pride and sorrow, for he had witnessed both the triumphs and tragedies of his people. But now, as he paced the stone corridors of the great mountain, the weight of an even darker burden pressed upon him. The dwarves of Erebor had been through many battles, fought many wars, but the threat that loomed now was unlike any they had faced before. The messenger from Thranduil had arrived 2 days ago, bearing the Elven King's quiet assent to Balin's proposal. It had been a gesture of trust, a rare and precious thing in a world where distrust ran as deep as the roots of the mountains themselves. Thranduil, the Elven King of Mirkwood, was not a friend to the dwarves, not by any means. But the dangers that threatened Erebor were too great to be fought alone. The forces they faced were unlike anything the dwarves had seen in centuries, shadows of creatures that lurked in the dark corners of the earth, twisted beasts that seemed to bleed the very life from the land they walked upon. Balin had spoken to the dwarves about this situation. He had told them that alliances must be forged, no matter how uneasy, if they were to stand a chance against the coming storm. But his words had been met with mixed reactions. Thorin, his nephew and the heir to Erebor, had listened with grim determination, but there was no warmth in his eyes. Thorin had always been proud, perhaps too proud, and the dwarves of Erebor had been deeply wounded by the long history of strife with the elves. It was not that they disliked all elves, but the memory of past grievances still hung heavy in their hearts. Balin knew that Thorin would not approve of his decision to reach out to Thranduil. But he had made it anyway, knowing that this was a battle that no one could fight alone. Balin sat in the stone chamber that served as his personal quarters, the flickering light of a fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. The room was simple, furnished with a few chairs, a table, and a bed of rough-hewn wood. He had always preferred to keep things modest. A large map of Middle-earth, marked with runes and symbols, spread out before him on the table, and Balin traced his finger along the lines that represented the borders of Erebor and the lands to the east. The shadows of the Easterlings had begun to creep toward them, and the creatures of darkness were not far behind. The question was not whether they would come, it was when. A knock on the door broke the silence. Balin looked up as the door opened to reveal Dwalin, his brother and closest ally. Dwalin's broad shoulders and heavy-set frame filled the doorway, and his stern face was as unreadable as ever. His eyes were dark with concern, but there was also a flicker of something deeper, something more uncertain. Balin, Dwalin said, his voice low. I've spoken with Thorin. He's not pleased. He thinks this alliance with the elves is folly. He believes it will weaken us in the eyes of our people. Balin sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. He had expected this. Thorin's pride had always been his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. The dwarves of Erebor were fiercely independent, and the idea of working with those they considered enemies, even if only for a time, was hard to swallow. Thorin was too proud to ask for help, especially from the elves, and Balin knew that. He had tried to reason with his nephew, but Thorin's mind was set. "I know, Dwalin," Balin replied quietly. "But you've seen it yourself. The Easterlings are coming. We cannot face them alone. And the elves have offered their assistance. It's the only option we have." Dwalin crossed the room and took a seat across from Balin, his eyes never leaving the map on the table. "I know. I don't like it any more than Thorin does, but I see the truth in your words. I've heard the whispers from the eastern hills. The shadows are gathering, and something far worse than men or orcs is rising in the darkness." Balin nodded grimly. "I've seen it, too. It's not just the Easterlings. They're being led by something darker. There are creatures in the east, beasts that have never been seen before, twisted things of shadow and flame. I don't know where they came from, but they're not of this world. They move like shadows, and wherever they go, the land withers. We can't afford to ignore it." Dwalin leaned forward, his brow furrowing in concern. "But what of Thorin? If he won't agree to this alliance, what then?" Balin hesitated for a moment, his eyes distant. "I don't know. But I've made my decision. If Thorin won't see reason, then I will do what I must. The survival of Erebor is more important than any pride, no matter whose it is." Dwalin's eyes softened slightly, though his expression remained stern. "You've always had the wisdom of a king, Balin. I only hope that Thorin sees the truth before it's too late." Balin nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of his responsibility. He knew that Thorin's pride was a force to be reckoned with, but he also knew that the young king had the potential to be great. There was more to Thorin than his anger and his stubbornness. But Balin also understood that there were times when a hard choice had to be made, even if it meant going against those you loved. The room fell silent as both dwarfs stared at the map. The distant mountains, the green valleys, and the winding rivers seemed peaceful on the surface, but beneath the calm, something darker was stirring. The shadows in the east were growing, and Erebor stood at the center of it all. "Have you sent word to Thranduil?" Dwalin asked after a long pause. Balin nodded slowly. "Yes. I sent a messenger to Mirkwood this morning. We'll have to wait for his reply, but I'm certain he'll honor the pact. He knows what's at stake. The Elven King may be proud and secretive, but I trust him. If we stand together, we have a chance." Dwalin let out a low grunt of approval. "Then we wait. But I fear that time is not on our side." Balin rose from his chair and walked to the window, his gaze drifting over the darkened mountainside. The fires of the forge still burned in the heart of Erebor, but there was a chill in the air that no amount of flame could chase away. The dwarves of Erebor were a proud people, but pride could not defeat an enemy of shadows. They needed allies, and whether Thorin liked it or not, the elves of Mirkwood were their best chance. The night was falling over Erebor, and the cold winds whispered through the cracks in the stone. In the shadows beyond the gates of the lonely mountain, something waited. Something dark and terrible. And with each passing day, it drew closer. The moon hung low in the sky over Mirkwood, its pale light casting long shadows through the trees. The forest, dense and ancient, whispered with secrets carried by the wind, its dark canopy a silent witness to the troubled times ahead. Thranduil stood at the edge of a great clearing, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His mind had not rested since the moment he had made his decision to send aid to Erebor. There was a cost to every decision, and this one weighed heavily on his conscience. The message from Balin had arrived, and the dwarves had made their preparations. But Thranduil knew the alliance he had forged, though born of necessity, was fragile. The history between the elves and the dwarves was a bitter one, filled with pride, betrayal, and loss. It was not easy for either race to lay aside their old grudges, and yet, in the face of the growing threat from the east, Thranduil had chosen to do just that. But there was something else. Something that had been gnawing at the back of his mind, something he could not ignore. The forces from the east were not merely a gathering of savage warriors and twisted creatures. They were led by something far darker, something far older than anything Thranduil had encountered in his long life. He could feel it in his bones, a deep, unsettling presence that seemed to stretch across the land, curling like smoke from a fire that had not yet been kindled. This enemy, whatever it was, had power far beyond what mere mortal armies could wield. Thranduil had sent messengers to his allies, those few elves who still held sway in the distant corners of Middle-earth, but he knew that their numbers were few, and their strength would be insufficient to face the growing darkness. Even with the dwarves of Erebor at his side, the battle ahead would be a hard one. The kingdom of Mirkwood was strong, yes, but it was not invincible. And Thranduil was not foolish enough to think that his people could hold the line alone. As the evening breeze stirred the leaves around him, Thranduil turned from the clearing and began to walk back toward his palace. His footsteps were silent on the forest floor, and his movements were graceful, as always. But there was a tension in his step now, a weight to his presence that was not there before. His thoughts were heavy, burdened by the decisions he had made. He had always been a king who acted with careful deliberation, but now, in the face of the coming storm, it seemed that even his careful planning might not be enough. Inside the great halls of his palace, the atmosphere was different from the quiet of the forest outside. The flickering light of torches illuminated the walls of the stone corridors, casting dancing shadows on the polished floors. The elves who inhabited the palace moved like phantoms, their eyes wary and their voices low. News of the alliance with Erebor had spread quickly, and it was met with skepticism and fear. There were few among the elves who trusted the dwarves, and fewer still who believed that an alliance with them could bring any benefit. Thranduil had called for a council to address these concerns. He had to explain his decision to his people, to calm their fears and reassure them that this alliance, though uneasy, was necessary for their survival. But as he entered the council chamber, he was met with silence, and it was a silence thick with unease. The elven lords and ladies had gathered around the long table, their faces grim and wary. They were all veterans of the battles fought in the years before, but none of them had ever faced an enemy like the one Thranduil spoke of now. The warriors of Mirkwood were skilled, but they had never fought creatures of shadow, creatures that could tear through their defenses like smoke through a net. "My king," said Lord Elrond, who had come to offer counsel despite the distance from Rivendell. His voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to his words that spoke of deep concern. "We understand the danger that threatens Erebor, and we know that no kingdom stands alone in times like these. But you must understand our fear. The dwarves, they have always been our enemies. Can we truly trust them, even in such dire circumstances?" Thranduil's gaze was unyielding. I know the history between our peoples, Lord Elrond. I have lived through it as much as you. But we do not have the luxury of letting past grievances cloud our judgment now. The enemy that approaches is not like anything we have faced before. If we do not stand together, we will all fall. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Thranduil's words hanging heavy in the air. Elrond, ever the voice of reason, nodded slowly, though his eyes betrayed his lingering doubts. "We understand, my lord," he said quietly. "But we must ask ourselves, if we ally with the dwarves, what will that mean for us in the long run? Will this alliance end in betrayal, as so many have in the past?" Thranduil's expression softened slightly, but his resolve was unchanged. "We will not let the past define us. If the dwarves betray us, we will deal with it in due time. But the threat is now. We do not have the luxury of waiting for betrayal. We must act." The council members exchanged uncertain glances, but none spoke against him. Thranduil had the respect of his people, even if they did not always agree with him. He was a king who had weathered countless storms, and his wisdom was unquestioned. But this time, the storm was greater than any they had faced before. "I will not force any of you to accept this alliance if you do not believe in it," Thranduil continued. "But I ask that you consider the alternative. We face an enemy whose power is beyond anything we have seen. If we do not stand together, we will fall. And if we fall, so too will all of Middle-earth." One by one, the council members nodded. It was not a decision they took lightly, but they knew that Thranduil was right. There was no other choice. As the council dispersed, Thranduil remained behind, lost in thought. The alliance with the dwarves was the right decision, but it would not be enough. There was still more to be done. The creatures from the east, those dark, twisted things, were not to be underestimated. They were not merely an army to be defeated, they were a force of nature, an embodiment of the very darkness that had plagued Middle-earth for ages. They had been summoned by some unknown power, and that power was what Thranduil feared most. He had sent for a meeting with Balin, the dwarf of Erebor, to discuss the next steps. The time for secrecy was drawing to a close. If they were to defeat this threat, they would need more than just an alliance, they would need to unite all the forces of Middle-earth. And Thranduil knew that would not be easy. It was not enough to send troops and weapons. They would need to forge a bond, a brotherhood that would transcend race, history, and pride. As Thranduil looked out over the moonlit forest once more, he felt a stirring deep within him. It was a feeling he had not experienced in many years, hope. Hope that perhaps, despite all the divisions and the betrayals of the past, there was still a chance for something greater. Something that would unite all the peoples of Middle-earth against the darkness that was coming. But that hope was fragile, and Thranduil knew that it would take everything he had to protect it. The morning light filtered through the towering trees of Mirkwood, casting long shadows upon the forest floor. The air was cool and crisp, the scent of pine and earth filling the lungs of those who ventured into the heart of the forest. But despite the natural beauty that surrounded him, Thranduil could not shake the unease that had taken root deep within his soul. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, and the weight of leadership pressed heavily upon him. As he stood on the balcony of his palace, overlooking the dark expanse of Mirkwood, Thranduil's thoughts lingered on the events that had led him to this point. He had made his choice, forged an alliance with the Dwarves of Erebor, but now the consequences of that decision were beginning to unfold. The meeting with Balin was set to take place soon, and the Elven King knew that the time for words was growing short. There could be no more delays. The forces of darkness were stirring, and their advance was relentless. Thranduil had long been a ruler who preferred solitude, his mind often wandering through the corridors of history, contemplating the actions of his ancestors and the delicate balance of power in Middle-earth. But the rise of this new threat, the creatures of shadow and flame from the east, had forced him into action. It was a battle unlike any other. The armies of men, dwarves, and elves would need to unite if they were to stand a chance against this terror. It was not just the survival of his own people at stake, it was the survival of all the free peoples of Middle-earth. Despite the unity that Thranduil had worked to create, there were those who resisted. His people, the Elves of Mirkwood, had always been wary of the dwarves. And while the alliance had been sealed with a gesture of diplomacy, the mistrust ran deep. Thranduil had made peace with this fact, for he knew that an alliance born of necessity was still an alliance. But as he paced the stone floors of his chambers, he could not shake the feeling that something greater was at play. The dwarves were not the only ones to be reckoned with in this war. There were darker forces at work, and they were far more than any of them realized. A knock on the door pulled Thranduil from his thoughts, and he turned to face the entrance just as the door creaked open. The figure who stepped into the room was tall, with long, silver hair that shimmered in the dim light. It was Legolas, his son, now grown and no longer the child who had once sought his father's approval in the quiet halls of their home. "Father," Legolas said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of unspoken thoughts. "The messengers from Erebor have arrived. They wish to speak with you." Thranduil nodded, his face a mask of calm resolve, though his eyes betrayed the flicker of concern that stirred within him. "Send them in," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. Legolas hesitated for a moment, as though he sensed the tension in his father's heart. He had always been perceptive, and Thranduil had never been one to hide his true feelings from his son. There was no need to, not with Legolas, who had grown into a warrior of great skill and wisdom in his own right. "There is something more, Father," Legolas added, his tone soft. "The air is thick with rumors. Whispers of unrest. Some of the elves in the kingdom are not pleased with your decision. They speak of betrayal, of distrust." Thranduil's gaze hardened, and he took a step closer to his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know, Legolas. I have not made this decision lightly. But we do not have the luxury of pride and mistrust. The forces we face are beyond what we can defeat alone. I must do what is necessary for the survival of our people and all of Middle-earth." Legolas met his father's gaze with a mixture of respect and concern. "I understand, Father. But be careful. The dwarves, they are not known for their loyalty. Even Balin, though honorable, may not speak for all of them." Thranduil nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in his son's words. The dwarves, though proud and steadfast in battle, were not always the easiest of allies. Their histories with the elves were marred by years of conflict, distrust, and old wounds that had never truly healed. And while Thranduil trusted Balin, he knew the dwarf to be a leader of wisdom and integrity. He also understood that the dwarves were a people defined by their pride, and that pride could be their undoing. "I will be cautious, Legolas," Thranduil said, his voice softened by the weight of his thoughts. "But we cannot afford to waste time. If we are to stand a chance against the darkness rising in the east, we must act swiftly. The dwarves are not our only ally in this fight. We must rally the free peoples of Middle-earth. Only then can we face what is coming." Legolas nodded, though his expression remained one of quiet concern. "I will stand by your side, Father, whatever comes. But I still fear what the future holds. The darkness, it grows stronger with each passing day." With a final glance, Thranduil turned and followed his son out of the chambers, their footsteps echoing through the corridors of the palace. The messengers from Erebor were waiting in the great hall, their faces set with the determination of warriors who had long been accustomed to hardship. The time for words had ended, the time for action was at hand. As they entered the hall, the two messengers rose from their seats, bowing low in respect to Thranduil. Balin had entrusted them with a message, one that would be delivered with both honor and urgency. "My king," one of the messengers began, his voice steady despite the tension in the air, "we come with word from Erebor. Our people are ready. The forces we bring are yours to command. The Dwarves of Erebor stand with you in this war. But we ask, in return, that you honor the pact we have forged. The Dwarves will fight alongside the Elves, but not for free." Thranduil's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded, understanding the meaning behind the words. The Dwarves were a proud people, and they did not fight without a price. It was a necessary condition, one that Thranduil had known would come to pass. But it was a price he was willing to pay, because he knew that without the Dwarves, they would not stand a chance. "The pact will be honored," Thranduil said, his voice low and steady. "The Dwarves will have what they need in exchange for their aid. But know this, the darkness that approaches is not one we can face alone, not even with the strength of Erebor at our side. We must unite all who are willing to stand against it. The free peoples of Middle-earth must stand together, elves, men, and dwarves alike." The messenger exchanged a glance with his companion, and then nodded. "It is as we have said. The dwarves are ready. But there is more, my lord. The creatures from the east, they are not merely an army of soldiers. There is something more to them. Something dark, ancient, and powerful. We do not know the full extent of their power, but we know they are led by a force beyond anything we have seen before." Thranduil's brow furrowed in thought. "I have felt it too. The darkness that stirs in the east, it is not just an army. It is a shadow that seeks to consume all light. I have heard whispers, though they are faint and unclear. Whatever this enemy is, it is not of this world." The messengers nodded gravely. "We will send word to Erebor, and we will await your instructions. But time is running short, my lord." Thranduil stood tall, his mind racing as he contemplated the words of the dwarves. This was no ordinary war. The enemy they faced was unlike anything the free peoples of Middle-earth had ever encountered before. The creatures of shadow, led by some unknown force, were not just invaders, they were harbingers of a far more terrifying power. "I will send word to the other realms," Thranduil said firmly. "We must prepare for the war ahead. Gather the elves, send for the dwarves, and call upon the men of the west. Together, we will stand against this darkness, no matter the cost." As the messengers left, Thranduil felt the weight of his decision settle even more heavily upon him. The future of Middle-earth rested on the alliances they had forged, but those alliances would only be strong if they held together in the face of the coming storm. And that storm, Thranduil knew, was closer than any of them realized. The sun had barely risen over the peaks of Erebor when the first of the elven reinforcements arrived. Thranduil stood at the gates of his palace in Mirkwood, eyes fixed on the horizon, where a small contingent of elven warriors was making their way toward him. The morning mist still clung to the trees, the air thick with anticipation. He could feel the stirrings of fate in the cool wind that swept through the branches of the ancient forest. It had been a week since he had sent his messages to the other realms, Rivendell, Lothlorien, and beyond. He had called upon allies, old and new, to unite against the darkness creeping from the east. The dwarves had already rallied to his side, as had many of his own people, but he knew the true test of their alliance was yet to come. The armies of Erebor had sent their first forces, and now it was up to the elves to join them and fulfill their part in the pact. The warriors who arrived were led by Legolas, Thranduil's son, a fierce and skilled archer in his own right. As Legolas dismounted from his horse, his green cloak billowing in the wind, he made his way to his father, his face set with determination. Behind him, the elves who had traveled from distant realms were equally resolute, their eyes focused on the task ahead. Thranduil met Legolas's gaze, and for a moment, the father and son exchanged an unspoken understanding. Though their roles as leaders of their respected people had often placed them at odds in the past, now they stood united in a cause greater than either of them could have imagined. It was not just the survival of Mirkwood that was at stake, nor the fate of Erebor. This war threatened all of Middle-earth, and only through unity could they hope to prevail. "You have brought them," Thranduil said, his voice steady as he addressed his son. "The reinforcements." Legolas nodded, his eyes scanning the assembled warriors. "They are ready, father. But I fear we may be running out of time. The enemy is closer than we think." Thranduil turned his gaze eastward, toward the distant mountains and the land beyond. The very air seemed thick with the weight of impending doom. The shadow that had begun to spread across Middle-earth was no longer a distant threat. It was real, and it was coming. The forces that had been gathering in secret now moved in full force, and if they did not act swiftly, the darkness would engulf them all. "I feel it as well," Thranduil said quietly, his voice low but carrying an undeniable urgency. "But we cannot afford to rush into battle without proper coordination. We must have a strategy, Legolas. The dwarves may be formidable in combat, but the elves of Mirkwood are unmatched in our knowledge of the forest. We must use our strengths to our advantage." Legolas stepped closer, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "And what of the men? They must have heard the call. Will they join us in time?" Thranduil's gaze shifted to the west, where the realm of Gondor lay. "We have sent word to Gondor, to Rohan. But they are far from here, and the road is long. I fear they will not arrive in time for the first clash. We must stand our ground until they do." As Thranduil spoke, a rider appeared on the horizon, his figure cutting through the mist as he approached the gates. He was a messenger from Rivendell, one of Elrond's trusted scouts. Thranduil's heart quickened as the rider drew near, for he knew that Elrond's response would be crucial to their efforts. It was a message that could change everything. The messenger dismounted swiftly, his face pale from travel, and approached the Elven King. "My lord," he said, bowing his head respectfully, "I bring word from Lord Elrond. He has received your message, and though Rivendell is far, they are ready to send aid. A company of archers, and more if needed. But there is more. There are rumors, strange and troubling, of unrest even within the Elven realms. Not all of the elves are willing to ally with the dwarves. The mistrust runs deep, my lord." Thranduil's eyes darkened. He had known that such divisions would surface, but hearing it confirmed in the messenger's voice brought a bitter taste to his mouth. "We do not have the luxury of such divisions," he said firmly, though a hint of sorrow flickered in his expression. "The war is upon us, and every elven bow is needed. We cannot afford to let pride tear us apart now." The messenger nodded gravely, understanding the weight of his words. "Of course, my lord. I will return to Rivendell and urge Lord Elrond to expedite the preparations. The men of Gondor, too, are preparing, though their forces are stretched thin. But they will come, as they always do. Together, we will face this." As the messenger departed, Thranduil's thoughts turned inward once more. Time was slipping away, and they were still not fully prepared. The forces of darkness in the east were many, and the rumors of their power grew stronger with each passing day. These were not mere armies of soldiers, these were creatures of shadow, born of ancient evil, and led by a power Thranduil could not yet fully comprehend. "I wish I could see what you see, Father," Legolas said, his voice pulling Thranduil from his musings. "You seem so sure of our victory, but I cannot help but feel that we are walking into the jaws of something far darker than we can imagine." Thranduil looked at his son, his eyes filled with the wisdom of ages. "It is not certainty that guides me, Legolas. It is necessity. Our survival depends on unity, and that is what I fight for. But even the most united armies are not invincible. There is much we do not yet know about this enemy, but we cannot allow fear to guide our actions. Fear will destroy us long before the enemy ever has a chance." Legolas nodded, though a shadow of doubt lingered in his eyes. He had grown into a warrior, strong and capable, but the weight of this war was heavier than any battle he had fought before. The fate of Middle-earth rested on their shoulders, and it was a burden he could not escape, no matter how far he ran. As the days passed, the forces continued to gather, elves from Mirkwood, dwarves from Erebor, and even some of the men of Rohan. Each race brought their own strengths, their own skills, and yet there was a palpable tension between them all. The dwarves and elves, though united by a common cause, still eyed each other warily. Old wounds had not healed, and it was clear that the alliance was fragile, though necessary. On the eve of battle, as the forces camped at the foot of the misty mountains, Thranduil stood alone atop a hill, looking out over the assembled armies. The firelight flickered in the distance, casting long shadows on the ground. He could hear the quiet murmurs of his warriors, the rustling of armor, and the steady beat of anxious hearts. But above all, he could hear the ever-present whisper of the wind through the trees, a reminder of the fragile balance of the world they inhabited. The armies of darkness were not far, and in the stillness of the night, Thranduil felt the weight of his decisions pressing down upon him. The path they had chosen was one of uncertainty, of sacrifice, and of risk. But it was also the only path that could lead to survival. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, Thranduil turned away from the horizon. The battle was about to begin. The sound of war drums echoed through the valley as the first rays of dawn painted the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. The air was thick with the tension of impending conflict, the ground beneath the feet of the assembled armies vibrating with the anticipation of what was to come. Thranduil stood at the front of the elven army, his long cloak billowing in the cold wind. His sharp eyes swept over the gathering of warriors, each face a reflection of the same grim determination. They were prepared, but even the bravest of hearts knew that the darkness that approached was unlike anything they had ever faced. The armies of Middle-earth were united here, though not in perfect harmony. The dwarves from Erebor had set up their camp on one side, their thick armor gleaming in the light, their hammers and axes ready. The elves, though fewer in number, stood poised and regal, their bows at the ready, their blades honed to perfection. The men of Rohan, though late in their arrival, had come in full force, their cavalry lined up, shining in their chainmail and carrying banners that fluttered in the wind. The sight of so many gathered in one place gave Thranduil a strange mixture of pride and unease. They had come together for one purpose, but the bonds between them were still fragile. He could see it in the eyes of his people, the mistrust that lingered beneath the surface. The elves were not accustomed to fighting alongside dwarves, and the men were strangers in the wild lands of Mirkwood. There was a palpable tension in the air, as though any spark could ignite a fire that would tear their alliance apart. Yet, despite these divisions, Thranduil knew that there was no turning back now. The enemy was coming, and they had no choice but to face it together. As he turned to survey the battlefield, he saw Legolas at the edge of the elven ranks, his bow slung across his back, his expression grim. His son had grown into a formidable warrior, but Thranduil could see the weight of the moment in his eyes. This was not just another skirmish, another battle in the long history of Middle-earth. This was a war for their survival. "We stand together now," Thranduil said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "No matter our differences, no matter the past, today we fight as one. This is not just the fate of Mirkwood or Erebor, or of Rohan and Gondor. This is the fate of Middle-earth itself. And if we are to have any hope of survival, we must stand united." The words were meant to rally the troops, but Thranduil himself was not immune to the fear that gripped the heart of every warrior present. The enemy was still an unknown, shrouded in darkness, led by a force whose very presence sent shivers through the minds of even the most battle-hardened soldiers. It had been whispered that the creatures of shadow had been gathering for years, silently preparing for the moment when they would strike. And now, that moment had come. Far in the distance, the first signs of the enemy appeared. A thick cloud of dust rose on the horizon, growing steadily larger as the dark forces approached. It was not the normal marching of soldiers, nor the steady beat of organized ranks. The enemy's approach was chaotic, a surge of movement that seemed more like a wave than an army, a tide of shadow, flowing relentlessly forward. Thranduil's heart quickened as the shape of the enemy's army began to take form. They were creatures unlike any he had ever seen, twisted figures, born from shadow and flame, their eyes burning with an unnatural light. There were no banners, no organized lines. They came as a storm, a disordered mass of hatred and death. "Ready yourselves," Thranduil shouted to his warriors, his voice cutting through the silence that had fallen over the army. "Today, we make our stand. Do not falter. Hold your ground, for the fate of all rests upon us." The elves took their positions swiftly, their bows raised, their eyes scanning the horizon. The dwarves clanged their weapons together, their voices raised in a war cry, and the men of Rohan began to organize their cavalry, ready to charge into the fray. Each race was different, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, but they were bound by a single purpose, to defeat the darkness that threatened to consume them all. Thranduil drew his sword, the blade glinting in the early light. It had been forged by the finest smiths of Mirkwood, its edge sharp enough to cut through the toughest armor, and its weight familiar in his hand. He took a deep breath, focusing his mind, clearing away any lingering doubt. He had fought many battles in his time, but none like this. This was not just the defense of a kingdom, but the defense of all life in Middle-earth. As the enemy drew closer, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Thranduil's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the advancing creatures. Their numbers were far greater than he had expected, and the dread that filled his heart grew heavier with each passing moment. The creatures were led by a figure cloaked in darkness, a shadow that seemed to radiate an aura of death and despair. This was the force they had feared, the one whose whispers had haunted the corners of their world. The first wave of the enemy surged forward, a mass of writhing bodies, their grotesque shapes barely discernible in the smoke and dust. They moved with unnatural speed, rushing toward the lines of the free peoples. Thranduil's heart pounded in his chest as the first arrows flew, a volley from the elven archers that sliced through the air with deadly precision. But the enemy did not falter. The arrows hit their mark, but the creatures seemed to be sustained by some dark force, their bodies regenerating even as they fell. By the Vala, what are these creatures? Legolas shouted, his voice tinged with disbelief as he loosed another arrow into the mass of writhing bodies. Thranduil's gaze darkened. They are not of this world, he muttered, more to himself than to his son. They are born from the shadows, forged by an ancient evil. The clash of steel filled the air as the first line of defense met the enemy head-on. The dwarves were the first to engage, charging forward with their battle axes raised, their thick armor clanging as they collided with the monstrous creatures. The battle was chaotic, loud, brutal, and unrelenting. The dwarves fought fiercely, their strength and endurance allowing them to hold their ground for a time, but the creatures were relentless, attacking in waves that seemed never-ending. The elves, too, fought with grace and precision. Their arrows flew like whispers on the wind, striking down enemies with deadly accuracy. But even their skills seemed to be waning against the onslaught. For every creature they felled, two more seemed to take its place. Thranduil's mind raced as he watched the battle unfold. They had to hold the line. They could not let the enemy break through. If the creatures breached their defenses, all would be lost. The men of Rohan, gallantly charging into the fray, added their strength to the battle. Their horses cut through the mass of enemies like a hot knife through butter, their riders swinging swords and lances with deadly intent. But the enemy seemed to take little heed of the cavalry's charge. The creatures adapted, moving in unnatural patterns, dodging and weaving in a way that made them nearly impossible to hit. Thranduil watched the battlefield, his mind calculating, assessing. He could see that the enemy was not a traditional army. It was more like a living force, an entity that could not be defeated in the conventional sense. It was as though the shadow itself had come to life, spreading and consuming everything in its path. The realization hit him like a cold wave. This was no ordinary war. They were not merely fighting for victory, they were fighting for survival against an enemy that was beyond their comprehension. As the battle raged on, the Elven King's thoughts drifted momentarily to the pact he had made with the dwarves. It had been forged in necessity, in the knowledge that without unity they would fall. And now, as the lines between friend and foe blurred, that pact seemed both fragile and sacred. Could they hold together? Could the elves, dwarves, and men truly unite against such a dark and overwhelming force? Thranduil's thoughts were interrupted by the roar of a new wave of creatures crashing into the ranks of the free peoples. The enemy's leader, a towering figure cloaked in shadow, advanced toward the front lines. His presence was oppressive, a palpable weight that seemed to crush all hope in its path. Thranduil gripped his sword tighter, preparing for the battle that was about to reach its most desperate moment. The battlefield was a maelstrom of chaos and bloodshed, a place where steel met shadow in a dance of life and death. The creatures of darkness, led by the towering figure cloaked in shadow, advanced relentlessly toward the heart of the Free People's Alliance. Thranduil, his eyes narrowed, watched as the ranks of elves, dwarves, and men struggled to hold their ground. The enemy surged forward in waves, a monstrous tide that sought to drown them all. The air was thick with the smell of blood and smoke, and the screams of fallen warriors echoed across the land. In the distance, the dark figure of the enemy leader moved with unnatural grace, his every step sending a ripple of dread through the hearts of those who faced him. His eyes glowed with a malevolent fire, and his presence seemed to drain the very life from the world. Thranduil's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the creature, knowing that this was the true test, the moment when all their hopes, all their struggles, would either be shattered or solidified. This was not a battle of armies, this was a battle of wills, a fight for the very soul of Middle-earth. Legolas! Thranduil shouted, his voice cutting through the din of battle. His son, a mere speck on the field of carnage, turned to meet his gaze. We must face him, together. If we do not, all is lost. Legolas's face was grim, but his eyes burned with a fire that mirrored his father's resolve. He nodded, drawing his bow and quickly nocking an arrow. Let us end this, father. Together. With that, the two elven warriors made their way through the chaos, their movements fluid and precise. They were a blur of motion, weaving through the battlefield, striking down enemies with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Thranduil's sword flashed, cutting through the dark creatures with a ferocity born of years of experience, while Legolas's arrows flew like whispers in the wind, finding their mark with unerring accuracy. But even as they made their way forward, the shadowy figure continued to draw closer, his form more imposing with each step. The ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet, and the darkness surrounding him grew thicker, as if the very air was being consumed by his presence. Thranduil could feel the weight of his power, the ancient evil that radiated from the creature like a suffocating fog. This was not a force that could be defeated with mere weapons. This was something far older, far darker, something that had been lurking in the shadows of Middle-earth for millennia, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they neared the enemy leader, Thranduil's mind raced. He knew that this battle was not one they could win through strength alone. The dwarves fought valiantly, their axes cleaving through the dark creatures with a fury that was unmatched. The men of Rohan charged forward on horseback, their lances aimed at the enemy with the determination of warriors who had nothing left to lose. But it was clear to Thranduil that their strength alone would not be enough. They needed something more. And that something, he realized, was the very essence of their unity. The pact that had been formed between the elves and dwarves, the tenuous alliance that had been forged in the fires of necessity, was their greatest weapon. It was not just their combined strength that would defeat the enemy, it was the bond they shared, the courage to fight side by side, despite centuries of mistrust. Legolas, Thranduil said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. We must rally them. The strength of our alliance is the only thing that can defeat him. Legolas glanced at his father, his brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? Focus your arrows on the leader, Thranduil said. But do not aim to kill. Aim to wound. If we can weaken his connection to the shadow, if we can break the link between him and the darkness that sustains him, the rest of his forces will falter. Legolas's eyes widened as he understood the plan. It was a risky move, one that could backfire if they were not careful, but it was the only chance they had. "I understand. Let us make it so." Together, father and son pushed forward through the ranks, their every step bringing them closer to the figure who stood at the heart of the storm. The enemy's forces seemed to part before them, as if they, too, recognized the significance of what was happening. The shadowy leader continued to move forward, his eyes burning with hatred as he locked eyes with Thranduil. There was something ancient in those eyes, something that transcended time and space. It was a being that had existed before the world had even taken shape, a creature of the void that had been awakened to reclaim the world as its own. Thranduil's heart raced, but his resolve did not waver. He had fought many battles in his long life, but none had carried the weight of this one. He knew that if they did not succeed, Middle-earth would fall. It would be the end of all things, of elves, dwarves, men, and every other creature that called the world home. As they reached the enemy leader, Thranduil raised his sword, ready to strike. But before he could make the move, the figure spoke, his voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the very air. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the leader said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of malice. "You are fools to think that your petty alliances can stand against the darkness that I bring. I am the harbinger of the end. You will all fall before me." Thranduil's grip on his sword tightened, and Legolas's fingers trembled on the string of his bow. But they did not falter. They had come too far to turn back now. "No," Thranduil said, his voice cold and steady. "We will not fall. Not today. We fight for the future, for the light that still exists in this world. And as long as that light burns, we will stand against you." With that, Legolas released his arrow, and it flew with deadly precision toward the enemy leader. The arrow struck the shadowy figure's chest, but instead of sinking into flesh, it passed through him as if he were made of smoke and darkness. The arrow found its mark, but it did not kill him. Instead, a shockwave of energy rippled through the battlefield, causing the creatures of darkness to recoil. The leader howled in pain, and for a moment, the darkness around him wavered, as if something inside of him had been broken. Thranduil did not hesitate. With a swift movement, he lunged forward, his sword slicing through the air with the force of a storm. It struck the leader's body, but once again, the sword passed through him as if he were no more than a mirage. But the leader was not invincible. With each strike, the shadow around him began to flicker, to fray at the edges. The darkness that had sustained him was weakening, and with it, the strength of his army began to crumble. The creatures that had once fought with relentless fury now hesitated, as if they, too, were tethered to the fading darkness. Legolas loosed another arrow, and this time it struck the leader's heart. There was a blinding flash of light, and then, as quickly as it had begun, the shadow crumbled. The leader's form disintegrated into smoke, and the darkness that had once consumed the battlefield began to dissipate, leaving only the cold winds of dawn in its wake. The armies of the free people stood in stunned silence, the battlefield eerily still. Slowly, the creatures of darkness began to retreat, their strength broken. The shadow that had threatened to engulf Middle-earth was no more. The alliance of elves, dwarves, and men stood victorious, but at great cost. The battlefield was littered with the fallen, and the air was thick with the scent of death. But for all the loss, there was also a sense of relief, a quiet triumph that, despite all the odds, they had prevailed. Thranduil looked to his son, his heart swelling with pride. They had done it. they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, not through strength alone, but through unity. The pact he had made with the dwarves, the trust he had placed in them, had proven to be the key to their survival. In that moment, Thranduil knew that the bonds forged in the fires of war would endure long after the battle was over. The alliances that had once seemed so fragile were now unbreakable, and Middle-earth had been saved. But even as the light of victory shone brightly on the horizon, Thranduil knew that the shadow would always be waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of the world. It was a reminder that, though they had won this battle, the war for the future of Middle-earth was far from over. And so, the Elven King stood, watching the sun rise over the battlefield, knowing that the fight was not yet finished, but for now, they had won. I hope you found peace in tonight's story, letting the quiet strength of Thranduil and the bond between the elves, dwarves, and men wash over you. As the echoes of their bravery fade into the night, take a moment to let your thoughts drift, free from worries, into a space of calm. Remember, no matter how challenging the journey, there's always light that follows the darkness, and with each passing day, new hope is born. Now, close your eyes, let your body relax, and allow yourself to fall into a deep, peaceful rest. Tomorrow is a new day, but for now, let sleep take you to a place of dreams where everything is calm and all is well. Good night, and thank you for sharing this moment. Sleep peacefully.